It is a sad fact that most Christians are not very familiar with church history or theology or apologetics, to say nothing of philosophy. We're going to try to remedy that here on this show in this first episode, really, of going through this book. We talked about it before with Ken Samples. We're going to go through classic Christian thinkers written by Ken Samples, starting with Irenaeus. So, if you want to learn more about church history and theology and what was happening throughout the church, then tune in. We're going to look straight at Irenaeus here in the first chapter. Who was Irenaeus? He was probably the first church father. He was well acquainted with Polycarp, who knew the Apostle John. He lived in the 2nd century. So he is sometimes said to be the real first church father who had real significance in theological issues and significant in the realm of tradition and history. He was an apologist and a theologian. We're going to look at some of what he said. He also wrote a couple of main books that we still have, others that we have lost. One is called Against Heresies, and the other is called Demonstration of Apostolic Teaching. So we're going to look in this episode at why Irenaeus is important, what he did, and then how we can apply some of what he did as an apologist and theologian to our own walk as Christians. Let's first look and see, what did he really do? Well, he was an apologist. What does that mean? It means that somebody is defending something. So a Christian apologist is one who defends the Christian faith. But what did he defend it against? Well, one issue that he defended against was called Gnosticism. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, Gnosis in English. And that word just meant knowledge. And so the Gnostics were very influenced by Plato, and they taught that matter and material things, physical things, were bad or evil, and we want to suppress that. Don't you hear that in the church today? We hear in the church today that the true person, the true real you, as it were, that God is really concerned with is your spirit or your soul. There's been some downplaying of the body and materiality in the church over the years, and that comes straight out of Gnosticism and straight out of Platonic thinking. In fact, some areas of Gnosticism were so bizarre and odd that they denied that even Jesus was physical in nature, and so this is called docetism, which says that from the Greek word dikeo, meaning that Jesus only seemed to have a physical nature, but he really didn't. So this was a heresy that reared its ugly head, and it's possible that some of the church, rather the New Testament writers like Paul, were talking about the Gnostics, possibly the Apostle John in his first epistle, maybe Paul in Colossians, where he talks about not be deceived by empty philosophy. Not philosophy as such, but bad philosophy. He doesn't say to not do philosophy, like he doesn't say to stop doing theology because some theology is bad. So Irenaeus was very influential in this debate with Gnosticism, which said that matter is evil, emphasizes the spirit. It also says that to be saved, you have to have some kind of secret knowledge, some kind of knowledge that you can't even be taught. You have to discover it on your own. And so this is something that was very, very strong and powerful in this time period, in the late 1st century, 2nd century. And Irenaeus was a strong figure against that. Thankfully, he was one of the who gave apologetic reasons as to why Gnosticism was wrong. It wasn't just to defend the faith against atheists or other groups, but also to defend Christianity against beliefs about its own system that were false. So we can thank Irenaeus for safeguarding the church in that regard. We see Gnosticism as Ken Samples says in his book, and I'm going to have a link to the book in the description. So I want you can get the book. We're going to go through it chapter by chapter. I'm not going to go through every part of every chapter. That would, one, take too long, and two, I don't want to give the book away. You need to go get the book. But I'll have a link for it in the description. It's a great book. Ken's a great writer. He's a great guy. So I encourage you to get it, to read it, and then if you would like to follow along here in these episodes that we're going to be doing. But Gnosticism has kind of come back in a sense. It's kind of, as Ken says, become popular again. It's become popular through the discovery of Gnostic text or Gnostic gospels, Gospel of Thomas, various other gospels, books like the Da Vinci Code of Dan that Dan Brown wrote back in the early 2000s. That was very popular. Kind of fell off the wagon here lately, I guess, but it was very popular at that time. And so Gnosticism is still somewhat around and somewhat popular. In fact, one of my students is teaching a course on that, and he's dealing with Gnostic. And there are actually Gnostic sects today, churches that practice Gnosticism. So it's not completely gone. So Irenaeus saying, get rid of all of them. They're still here. So you and I can still do apologetics in that regard. But Irenaeus also argued against what's called Marcionism, which was the idea that Marcion did not like certain aspects of the Bible and took certain parts of it out. And so Irenaeus argued that the canon, which he already had, the canon is the set of books that were recognized to be inspired by God. They were recognized that way, and then they were seen to be scripture. Well, Irenaeus had the full canon at this time, and so he argued against the Marcion canon and those who followed Marcion. And so we can thank him for, again, helping shape a lot of what we see in the early church. He also was an early defender of divine simplicity. And if you've seen this channel at all, I've talked about simplicity. If you listen to my talks on God and his attributes, I talk a lot about divine simplicity, and I'll keep saying more about it. It is the doctrine that God is not made up of any kind of parts. He's not made up of any kind of, for most obviously, not physical parts. He also is not made up of any kind of philosophical parts that we talk about, whether it's essence and existence. We don't have to exist. We do exist. We don't have to. Talk about God, though, being a necessary being, meaning that he can't fail to exist or he can't not exist. We also talk about aspects of our being that we don't have to have. Like my hair is blonde or dirty blonde, and it doesn't have to be that way. My eyes don't have to be the color they are. Yours don't have to be the color they are, but they are. So these are characteristics that we have that could be different. So these are considered attributes of ours or characteristics. And so we talk about God having attributes, but we don't want to say that they modify him or change him. That causes a lot of problems. Well, Irenaeus was a defender of this doctrine that became the cornerstone of philosophical theology throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the modern period, throughout the Reformation, and even today, a lot of Christians defend the doctrine of divine simplicity. There are people who disagree with it. There are detractors from it. William Lane Craig is a famous detractor. Ryan Mullins. James White is having a different spin on divine simplicity. I'm going to planning on having a response to one of his videos on that topic. But it's a very important doctrine that says God is not put together. And the reason that Irenaeus and others think one reason that God's not put together is that if he has these various aspects of his being, parts, whatever you want to call them, he's complex in some way, then those parts could potentially unravel, or there got to be something underlying why those particular parts are the way they are. We get to Aquinas in the 13th century, later on from Irenaeus, another 1,000 years or plus. Then Aquinas has more developed reasons based on Aristotle's metaphysical system that God is not composed of anything, because that would require a composer, and therefore God is pure act and therefore simple. So Irenaeus is an early defender of that kind of teaching of divine simplicity. He also is a proponent of a theodicy that's come to be known as soul-making theodicy. He didn't call it that, but it came to be known that. That term really is made popular by people like John Hick, who is a pluralist. He's not an Orthodox Christian the way that Irenaeus was. But soul-making theodicy, a theodicy is an attempt to try to explain why God allows evil. And that would be different from a defense, which would say not why God allows evil, but the fact that we can account for both God's existence and evil at the same time. And if you want to be really fancy about it, you could say we want to say that God's existence is compossible with evil. That's a big philosophical word that means it can exist simultaneously. So we want to argue that God's existence is compossible with evil, or able to be alongside evil. We can give a defense for that. And so one popular evidence for that is the free will defense. One popular example of that is the free will defense. And that was given by Planting and others before him, which says that there's just no logical way that God could create free creatures without giving them the opportunity to sin and be evil. So a defense just wants to say there's a logical explanation for why God can exist with evil, as opposed to a theodicy, which says, here's the reasons behind why God allows evil. Well, the reasons that Irenaeus wanted to give that have become popular and called this kind of soul-making theodicy is that by undergoing suffering and troubles and trials, that we become more and more like Christ, that we are sanctified, that we are purged through our suffering and trials and all that. And through those trials, we are made more like Christ. So suffering is a good thing. And we're told in the New Testament that we're going to suffer. I've mentioned before in the channel, I was in the Word Faith movement for a while. They don't like suffering. There's a lot of Christians who don't like to talk about suffering. But the New Testament is very clear. You're going to suffer. You're going to suffer for the sake of Christ. And that could be severe suffering, like martyrdom or being thrown in prison or beaten, or it could be less severe, like your rights being taken away and not being able to do certain things. We see a continuum of that. But Christians are told they're going to suffer. And so Irenaeus is trying to make sense of that and say that suffering is not inherently completely evil anyway, or completely bad, because it brings us closer to God and makes us more like God. John Hick's version is a little bit different in saying that, well, it's very different. And it's based more on evolutionary biology and saying that we are becoming more a human. Our soul is becoming more human-like through suffering and through our evolution. And so Irenaeus has this soul-making theodicy. He also has a lot to say about salvation, the atonement. But how can we learn from Irenaeus? What can we do to emulate him? Well, first, it's good for us to be aware of who these people are. We're going to look at a lot of these different people here on the show. We got Irenaeus. Next time we have Athanasius. And then we have Augustine, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Blaise Pascal, and C.S. Lewis. So a lot of people we're going to look at. One way that we can appreciate Irenaeus and learn from him is to understand that it is a good thing to be Christian apologist. It doesn't mean you have to go to school to become an apologist. It doesn't mean you have to be an expert or a scholar, but that it is important to defend the historic Christian faith, not just against atheists, against all kinds of people who are actually Christians themselves, who are teaching an aberrant view of God, that God is either physical or not a Trinity, or anything like that at all, against Gnosticism like Irenaeus did. So it's important to understand that there is a real role and value for apologetics within the Christian faith, which also shows that reason and faith are compatible. There's a big debate today about the role of reason, how it relates to faith. It's my position that reason and faith cannot contradict each other, that you don't have your faith in some box over here and your reason over here, but that your reason and your faith relate to each other. And there's a lot of debate about this, about, well, is philosophy bad? Is reason bad? And Irenaeus and the others, as we're going to look through this book, as well as the Bible itself, shows that Christianity is not meant to be a religion that's based on quote unquote blind faith, but we are supposed to have, to rip off a book title, reasonable faith, and base our views on evidence and good reason, good arguments, and be able to, as Paul says, to knock down arguments that exalt themselves against the truth. So we should be able to do that. We also should be just aware of basic theology. So Irenaeus, in order to do this, had to be aware of basic Christian theology. So we have to do that. And we're doing that now in this study. So if you want to learn more about basic church history, and it's going to be basic, we're not going to go into a great amount of depth in the church history, but these are some of the top guys that you should be aware of who have been influential throughout church history. And so if you want to learn more about that, want to learn more about what were some of the theological issues going on, what were some of the apologetic issues, philosophical issues, those are 3 areas that Ken wants to hit on in this book: issues of apologetics, philosophy, and theology. So go get the book, grab it. There'll be a link in the description. I'm excited about it. It's going to be a lot of fun. There you have Irenaeus. Go read that chapter, and we'll look at Athanasius next time. If you like this video and want to learn more about these topics, then like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.